Bienvenue, bienvenidos, Yosoko to Global Reach 2019. My name's Ruth Selleck. I'm the chair of Britain's Energy Coast Business Cluster Shadow Board and also Marketing Communications Executive for Redefining. So today we're talking about the future, a future that looks outwards, a future that embraces change. So that's different ideas from different people, from different places. And the question we're going to be focusing on is, what are we going to do about climate change? How can we, as professionals working within the energy sector, make sure that the energy of tomorrow is clean, innovative, and sustainable? The answer is we need to talk to each other and to learn from each other. And hopefully you'll see that reflected not only in our programme of speakers today, but in our panel discussions and also our one-to-one programme of collaborative business meetings. How do we, as professionals working within the energy sector, address the subject of climate change? And what role does nuclear energy have in that? So who better to start this conversation than our keynote speaker today, founder of the DC-based research institute, the Energy Impact Centre, and host of the Titans of Nuclear podcast, Bret Kugelmass. Please join me in welcoming him to the stage.
United Kingdom, thank you for having me. For the last few months, I've been presenting at nuclear conferences across the world. In Slovenia, Vienna, Brazil, to name a few. But I am especially excited to be here. No, not just because nothing's going to get lost in translation, but because you have demonstrated a sufficiently independent nuclear program. And since the birth of this wondrous technology, and you may just be the country to reinvent energy itself. Never before has the world been more prosperous, very much thanks to abundant energy. Yet it seems these resources, which have given us so much wealth, will also lead us on a path toward environmental catastrophe and perhaps take it all away. But is this a choice we really have to make? Can't we have prosperity, abundance, consumption, but also environmental preservation and a stable climate? According to many of the loudest voices in the climate change debate, no. They insist that we have to tax ourselves, that half the world must stay in energy poverty. But I reject this notion. So today, we're going to walk through what the climate conversation has wrong. Similarly, we will discuss what the nuclear industry has wrong. And I will present a path forward where we can fix both and our planet along the way. The mainstream narrative around climate change has two things wrong. The first, just how important energy access is. That for most, it means more to them than climate change does. And the second, just how much energy will be required to stop our planet from warming. Let's start with number one. Although we don't touch energy directly very much throughout the day, it's far more than just petrol and leaving the lights on longer. Energy is in food, in medicine, in buildings. Energy moves goods and people across the globe. Energy is in everything you need. And energy is at the core of what you love about a prosperous world. Restricting energy, on the other hand, with higher costs, means real hardship is spread throughout every part of life. This is why we decide to subsidize energy at every opportunity, as the benefits from inexpensive power are so profound. Let's observe a very similar trade-off humanity has already made. We knowingly continue to pollute the air with particulate, causing millions of cancers and asthmas every year just to receive slightly cheaper energy. We have had the medical reasons and technology to replace coal for over half a century. But the only thing that ever meaningfully has is another cheaper form of power. Do we really expect a worldwide consensus on sacrifice now? Across all age, class, and creed? To combat a threat distant in time and place? What the climate elite ignore is that to anyone but the absolute wealthiest, choosing more expensive energy isn't even an option. So I claim that to solve climate change, considering the history and present state of this societal trade-off, we will need an energy source that is both carbon-free and the cheapest possible source. Not just for electricity, but for heat as well. And if that wasn't hard enough, this brings us to problem number 2. Who here believes that if we were to eliminate all new emissions across every sector, that this would fix climate change? It won't even slow it down. You heard me correctly. Zero out emissions globally in every single sector: electricity, transportation, agriculture, industry, heat, and you would not even notice a difference. The atmosphere would continue to capture extra heat at the exact same rate that we are adding extra heat today. Greenhouse gases act as a valve, not a sponge. Carbon dioxide in the air controls the rate of heat addition, not the magnitude of temperature. So until we remove the 1,000 gigatons of CO2 that we've already emitted, the Earth will continue to grow warmer and warmer year over year. Even if we eliminate all new emissions but did nothing about the past, the end result, but for a slight shift in time, would be exactly the same as if we had done nothing at all. Most experts won't acknowledge this, because the implications of which limit us to a very narrow subset of solutions. You see, virtually all climate advocates who claim to be on the right side of science, when convenient to their agenda, totally ignore the math. If we want to stop climate change at all, we have to create so much low-carbon energy that we can, 1, replace all fossil fuels, 2, account for the embedded emissions of that energy source, and 3, power the removal of the last 200 years worth of carbon emissions. Now, 2 years ago, I started the Energy Impact Center with that problem in mind. 2 years ago, I had never met a single nuclear engineer in my life. And 2 years ago, when I ran that math, everything changed. You see, if you take those two constraints, that you must account for previous emissions and do so in a way that directly increases prosperity, it leaves us only one path. We must take the very things that require energy and result in the release of carbon dioxide and force them, by definition, to capture and sequester carbon dioxide. In other words, we need to make fuel and products just as we do today, but with hydrogen and carbon from the air instead of from the ground. In this scenario, nothing downstream needs to change, and energy consumption all of a sudden has the exact opposite effect on climate. Let me make this crystal clear. If you use carbon from the air, the more people consume, the more prosperity we enable, the faster we will solve climate change. This is a perfect alignment of individual behavior, market forces, environmental health, and human well-being. If you want to actually solve climate change, you just need to make carbon-negative fuels and products cheaper than carbon-positive fuels and products. But to do so, requires extreme energy abundance and an extremely low carbon footprint. According to the laws of physics, there is only one energy source that is powerful enough to meet these requirements. When I learned that atomic forces are 3 million times the strength of chemical bonds, I almost couldn't believe it. And for the first time, I knew that climate change was truly conquerable. To have synthetic fuels compete economically with fossil fuels, you need to produce heat 3 times cheaper. You start off with a 3 million times advantage. And in order to save the world, the goal is just to get 3 times cheaper. After I learned about that energy density, from that moment forth, I swore I would talk to every person in the entire nuclear industry if I had to, in order to understand how we can make this a reality. I am now over 1,500 such conversations in, and today, I will share with you what I've learned. In the last 2 years, I've asked over 10,000 questions to experts across technology, politics, industry, regulations, economics, and more. 100 trips to labs, power plants, universities, and conferences in over a dozen countries. I have never met such a talented group of people. Masters of physics, chemistry, operations, mathematics, engineering. And I'm truly honored to now consider myself part of this community. This is what makes what I'm about to say so much more difficult. The challenges the nuclear industry faces are entirely our own fault. As the only group powerful enough to destroy a 6 order of magnitude advantage is the very group that possesses it. How is it possible that an otherwise standard thermal power plant with negligible fuel costs is more expensive than a coal plant? How is it possible that an industry has become so obsessed with safety when they started off with the naturally safest power source that could ever exist? The public mistrust is rational. The attacks from environmentalists are deserved, not because nuclear energy is dangerous, but because we have convinced them it is. So now, let us discuss both nuclear waste and nuclear accidents to demonstrate how for the last 40 years, everything that we've been trying to do to make things better, technologically and socially, has in fact been making things worse. The theory of hazard with nuclear waste is that if it entered the environment, it would somehow find its way into our food and water, and somehow give people cancer. We have been designing solutions to prevent this for so long that we no longer even challenge the premise, even though it is a ridiculous assertion to begin with. It was Chernobyl that definitively proved that out of every radioisotope that could ever come out of a power reactor, only iodine-131 is of concern. We are now 3 decades later, and we know that not cesium, nor strontium, nor any other isotope of iodine caused any damage to humans. And that's at Chernobyl levels of contamination. But when discussing how to handle nuclear waste, we forget that by definition, there's no iodine-131 left after just a few months, since it has a half-life of just 8 days. The very thing that makes certain isotopes dangerous is the very thing that makes them forever disappear. Just because some isotopes are radioactive for millions of years doesn't mean they're harmful for millions of years. In fact, It is only by consolidating waste that we have created the hazard of proximity, where there needn't be one at all. Society has always had two extremely effective strategies for all toxins that industry creates. We know they work because every other industry produces thousands of times more waste. Our two strategies: we either place it in a landfill or we dilute it. Dilution is perfect. Dilution is why we purposefully add chlorine to our drinking water, even though we wouldn't drink a glass of cleaning supplies with a higher concentration of that same chlorine. Landfill is also great. Toss in a pile of dirt and that's it. Very cheap. Nuclear waste is not a special hazard. It is our actions that create the threat. It is our actions that create public fear. The technical and societal answer to solving the nuclear waste problem is the same. Treat it like you would every other industrial waste stream. You guys ready to hear about nuclear accidents? The theory that there is a hazard to the public from light water reactors is borderline absurd. A meltdown where you have boiled off your coolant means you have boiled off your moderator, which means you have no more criticality and a known quantity of decay heat to deal with. Enough to melt some metal, dissolve some concrete, but even the 450,000 kilojoules from a gigawatt scale reactor is not enough to melt more than a few feet of dirt. Economic incentives alone would be sufficient to make sure that this almost never happens. But mandating perfection through the law makes any system more complex than it needs to be. It makes an accident more likely to happen, and it makes it more dangerous when it does. We have seen this play out with the idea of airtight containment, which as a safety strategy is truly counterproductive. In an asinine attempt to collect every radioactive atom, we trap hydrogen instead of just letting it dissipate, collecting the fuel for a bomb. Furthermore, restricting volume in the presence of a heat source creates the pressure for a bomb. And as we saw at Fukushima, even when this hydrogen gas pressure bomb explodes and scatters what would have been otherwise non-volatile source term into the environment, it is in such low quantities that no one from the public is ever at any risk. If the 3 gigawatts of core source term plus decades of spent fuel blown up by hydrogen didn't scatter enough radiation to hurt anyone, how can we still classify a light water reactor meltdown as a special accident that needs special regulations? If all we did was poke a permanent hole in containment, both physically and ideologically, then in the occasional meltdown, we could just let it melt down. Radioactive gases would escape, instantly dilute, and be no threat. Radioactive liquids would stick to the walls and floors and be absolutely no threat. Radioactive solids would sit in a molten puddle in the room and be absolutely no threat. The molten puddle would move at most a few feet into the ground and be absolutely no threat. It would be a hot mess in a single room and nothing else. No one is asking the public to clean it up with their tongues. If you just wait a few months and then bulldoze it into the ground and spray it with enough water, you will, by definition, dilute the radionuclides to the point where they are absolutely no threat. Forever. If you are so worried about a few kilograms of iodine-129, pour some iodine-127 on it. If you're so worried about some cesium-137, pour some cesium-133 on it. All radioactive isotopes can be rendered inert to biology instantly via dilution with just a few $1,000s of stable isotopes. Let us never forget that at Fukushima, there was no hazard from the negligible contamination of the land. The only hazard was in evacuation, where it was not radiation, but rather the Japanese government that needlessly decided to destroy the homes and livelihoods of 100,000 of their own people. Just like with nuclear waste, with accidents, it is our actions that create the threat. It is our actions that create public fear. The public will accept nuclear energy as they do any other energy infrastructure if we, the experts, treat nuclear just like it is any other energy infrastructure. But even more important than public acceptance, which is nice but not necessary for an industry to thrive, are the economic benefits of treating it like any other infrastructure. By removing the burdensome influence of overprotection, we will allow innovation, competition, and manufacturing at scale. We will drive prices to new lows and speed of deployment to new highs. I know a lot of what I'm saying may come across as a bit abrasive, a bit shocking, very controversial. But I have now given this talk at a dozen universities, national labs, and international conferences, and the reaction that I get from the industry never fails to impress me. Even though I am challenging the very core of a nuclear engineer's identity, and perhaps their entire career's worth of work, without fail, these same nuclear engineers stand up and thank me for saying what they've always felt, but their career has prevented them from discussing openly. So I am here in the United Kingdom to establish a precedent of standing up to the cultural norms of this industry that have driven it into obsolescence, that have robbed the world of clean air and cheap energy for the last 5 decades, that have driven us to use every other less safe energy source. I ask that the UK nuclear industry be brave enough to stand up and declare that real public safety is more important than arbitrary levels of radiation protection. I am here in the UK to challenge you to prove that you are truly risk-informed by establishing a simplified framework up front, where a license is approved instantly, so long as the applicant satisfies 4 simple rules. 1, reactors must have inherent negative neutronics, just like all light water reactors already do. 2, reactors must not be able to catch on fire, just like all light water reactors. 3, reactors must not have airtight containment. A strong roof is more effective for source term confinement. And 4, dilution is a sufficient strategy to clean up both waste and accidents. Or, if you fundamentally disagree with any of the points I've made so far, I challenge you, take my money. I have funded a prize for $10,000 if you can demonstrate why these rules aren't adequate for public safety. None of your colleagues throughout Europe, South America, or the United States have been able to do so yet. Will anyone in this room be the first? Take a second to process the implications of what I am saying. United Kingdom, if you know how to build a coal plant and buy fuel assemblies, there is nothing about a light water reactor that you can't design yourself. Drop the 90% of equipment, personnel, and processes that are totally unnecessary and in fact make nuclear plants less safe. If you establish a new paradigm for nuclear licensing, then within just a few years, you will have guaranteed the cheapest energy on planet Earth for your citizens, and in doing so, create a serious advantage for your industry. You will improve the health of hundreds of thousands, save real lives, not statistical ones, by virtually eliminating air pollution overnight. You will double your economy, selling nuclear plants across the developing world, bringing prosperity to everyone. And you will become a model for Europe and the rest of the world to follow, and for the rest of human history. Be remembered as the country that actually solved climate change. Thank you.